Okay. So thank you, Manali, Urvi, and Launchpad for this opportunity. And when I came to know about Launchpad, I was really very fascinated because I think this kind of platforms are really missing. I mean, there are a lot of career counselors and those kind of platforms, but they are still very traditional, and the real world is not at all traditional. So most of the things people end up doing, or the interesting things, are things which you don't know, learn in your school. And Launchpad precisely brings those kind of things to students. So that's why kudos to the Launchpad team. And I'm really very excited to talk to you all. And what I understand is this is a very mixed background, a mixed crowd, in the sense that most of you are probably students, but the range is huge. Like I know at least there is one 7-year-old, and then all the way up to, I don't know, and I know there are seasoned linguists also. So I will try my best to cover things at a level which every one of you should be able to appreciate. But feel free to ask questions. Maybe since there are many people here, so if you have questions, just keep put it on the chat, and whenever periodically I might stop and request Manali or Urvi to read them out to me. And of course at the end we will have some time for Q&A. And I will also ask you some questions. And I don't know what's the best way to answer them. If some of you have the answers, you can just pick up probably. Otherwise, you can also type in the chat box. So with that, let's start. I have only one request to all of you. Please, mute your phones and maybe also your videos for this part. And you can turn on your videos again when we enter the Q&A session, just for the bandwidth, because sometimes it might not work. I will also switch off my video and share my screen. So you should be able to see the slides now. Let me know when you can see.
Yeah, I can see. I hope everyone else is able to see.
Yep. Yes, I can see.
Cool. Okay.
Okay.
All right, we're going to mute everyone now. Yeah.
Okay, so welcome aboard this ship, and we will get into a trip through this magical world of languages. But before we start, navigating through this world, uh, I will give you a brief introduction to give you a sense of what you are going to see in this journey. So I will do it through a puzzle. Here is some phrases in Japanese, and they are also translated in English. So Japanese is written in a different script, but for ease of you to read, I have transcribed it in Roman alphabet. So you can see this boru niko means 2 balls, chuna nihon means 2 ropes, and so on. And then there's a question: what is the Japanese for 9 cucumbers? And 4 options. I will let you, look at this data for maybe a minute. You should be able to solve it. I mean, at least read through it in a minute or so. And then if somebody has any, answer to it, maybe you can. Is there a raise hand option here? I don't see it. So maybe you could just put it on the chat.
Yeah. There should be a raise hand option actually. But yeah, you guys can go ahead and put it on the chat.
So I see Jennifer Yen says it's A. Jennifer, can you explain why you think it's A? Oh, I think Jennifer can't probably unmute herself. That's okay. So in that case, maybe I will work you through this. So some of the things are very easy to see, right? So what is the the what we call the morpheme or the uh, word for two? So it seems all the two ones have ni, and similarly all the five ones have go. So two balls seems to be transcribed in Japanese or translated in Japanese as balls followed by two. So boru should be balls and chuna should be ropes and so on and so forth, right? And a ni should be two, and similarly go should be five. So far so good. But what are these ko, hon, to, mai, which are kind of repeated in the for the both 2 and 5 cases? And if you see the question, right, 9 cucumbers, so curry must be cucumber, and there is no confusion. All the options have curry, otherwise you wouldn't have got it. Cucumber was not in the problem data. But and ku must be 9, and you have hon, ko, to, and there is something hiki which you haven't seen before. But let's see what's going on with this hon and stuff like that. So it seems like balls and cats have ko, ropes and legs have hon, horses and rhinos have to, and sheets of paper and 5 plates have mai. So does that ring a bell? Horses and rhinos, definitely large animals. Paper and plates, something which is flat and spread out, thin. Then what's common between balls and cats? Maybe the size. Cats can also be more like roundish, and balls and cats might be of the similar size range. And what about ropes and legs? Or in other words, if you were to put cucumber in any of these categories, where would you fit it? It seems like, I mean, at least according to Jennifer's answer, she's saying it's kuhon. So horn would be for ropes and legs. And why that might be, somebody might argue, okay, that's because ropes are also long, legs are also long, longish, thin things. So cucumber is also long and thin. So maybe that's the reason, right? So yes, Jennifer, you are right. It's Curie Kuhon. But of course, with this much of data, you can't always deduce completely. So it might be also Curie Kuhiki. You don't know what Kuhiki is, Hiki is. And it might be for fruits. So it could be also Curie Kuhiki. But turns out it's actually Curie Kuhon, because in Japanese, depending on the shapes of the objects and all, you divide nouns into classes, and accordingly you talk of the numbers, and is this something which is very unique to Japanese? Doesn't it happen in other languages? If anybody is here from speaking Assamese, they would know Assamese has exactly the same phenomenon. Flat things are referred in certain ways, long things are referred in some other ways, certain things are referred in pairs and so on. And similarly in Bangla, right, you have human things are referred in certain ways, and non-human things are referred in some other ways. So languages somehow divide nouns into various classes, and this is quite common across languages. And what's interesting is most of you probably didn't know Japanese before looking at this puzzle, but it's still possible to derive the answer to this question, this puzzle, by just looking at only this much of data. And how did you do that? Because all of us have what we call meta-linguistic intuition. Since we speak languages, and maybe we speak more than one languages, we know what are common between languages, how languages typically work. And that's what you are using while you are trying to solve this problem. And as I was talking about, is it common only does it happen only in Japanese? No, it happens across many languages. And linguists call this phenomenon, of dividing nouns into classes as, of course, noun classes. And this is about how languages categorize nouns into different classes. And once it categorizes them into classes, they actually influence the grammar. So it could influence how verbs inflect. So one very common way of categorizing nouns is into masculine, feminine, and neuter. And Hindi, for instance, does it between masculine and feminine. So that actually determines the verb form. So jata hai or jati hai. So feminine versus masculine is a noun class categorization dimension for Hindi. And of course, I already talked of Bangla. There are other languages which does human, non-human. There are languages which does animate, inanimate. So there are various ways people do noun classes. And these are broadly called gender in a language, or grammatical gender. So when we talk of gender, we typically think of masculine, feminine, right? But that's a very limited view of gender. So gender, if you look at world's languages, can be represented in a very, very rich and varied ways. In fact, there are a class of languages, family of languages. These are called Bantu languages, spoken somewhere between mid and South Africa. And in these languages, they have a very rich classification of nouns. So some of these Bantu languages have as many as 22 noun classes or genders. And on the left, the table that I show is the classes, noun classes in a language called Swahili. Swahili is spoken in Southern Africa. And you see the classes, like there are singular persons, there are singular plants, plural persons, plural plants, then fruits, then things, then animals, and so on and so forth, right? So a very, very elaborate classification. And this is very important because, you know, you need to know this classification because the verbs, the adjectives, everything will, in the grammar of the language depends on this classification. And now the funny thing, a very funny and famous thing, is there's a language called Dyirbal. It's spoken in Australia, northeastern corner of Australia. And in this particular language, there are four classes, four noun classes. So there are animate objects, which include also men. Then there is a special class which has women, but also water and fire and violence. And then there are edible fruits and vegetables, and there are miscellaneous, everything else probably. Now, this is really, really interesting, right? Why women is put with water and fire and violence. So a very famous linguist, George Lakoff, wrote a book, taking this idea. The title of the book is Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. How, linguistic categorization influence the cognitive categorization. How we classify in our language depends on how we view the world as. And somehow they view women and water and fire and violence in the same category for some reason. Yeah. So with that bit of a, kind of a starter, I would say, let's begin our journey. Now, if it was exciting, so then what I'm going to do in the next half an hour or 40 minutes or so is I will take you through four, I would say four islands. One, I will start with linguist conundrums, where I will mostly talk about what is linguistics all about. What are all the various questions linguists ask and try to solve? And after that, I will move to more towards what I do, which is what I call talking machines. So how you make computers understand human languages, why that's a hard problem. Followed by a little bit towards the end, I will talk about my own journey, how I got into it, what are the things I have worked on, what are things I'm working on right now. And I will end with a few, pointers on how you can start your journey by yourself, where you can study, find out more about linguistics and stuff like that. Now, it has been quite a challenge to summarize linguistics and computational linguistics, as well as my personal tale and everything, in a matter of, let's say, 30 or 40 minutes. I will try my best, but I will not try to be comprehensive at all. I will leave out most things. And what I have selected to tell you are only things which I thought was interesting, or I would be able to explain you easily. But as you can understand, it's a very vast field with lots and lots of interesting things and lots of new things we are discovering every passing day about language. So starting with linguist conundrums, right? So one thing you should never ask a linguist is how many languages they speak. That just puts off any linguist. And that's because it's almost like asking a theologian like how many religion they practice, right? Or doctors how many diseases they have, engineers how many engines they possess. How ridiculous those questions are, right? Similarly, it's as ridiculous as those questions, right? When you ask a linguist how many languages they speak. So it's like, you know, a closest analogy I can draw is with a botanist or a zoologist, right? Or a biologist. So it's not that a botanist has a lot of plants in their garden, or a zoologist will have a lot of animals in their home as pets. What it means to be a zoologist or a botanist is to know about and study plants and animals and how they behave, etc. So similarly, for a linguist, the thing is they are studying languages and they know a lot about languages, but not necessarily the languages. So they may not be, I mean, I just speak, let's say, 3 or 4 languages, and I'm sure most of you would be speaking 3 or 4 languages right here. But it's not that I speak any more languages than you do. So but I know a lot about, like, I know about Dyirbal, I know about Mundari, I know about Andamanis, what happens in those languages, even though I don't speak those languages. So the first problem that any language linguist has to solve is how to describe languages, right? When you are studying something, you are studying plants or studying animals, you have to first describe them, what you are studying. So for a linguist, the question is how to describe a language. And mind you, it's not prescribe a language. You know, what you study in your school about language and grammar is what in linguistics we call prescriptive grammar. Somebody tells you, well, this is the right way of saying this and this is not the right way of saying this, right? And you are asked to answer questions, and if you are wrong in your grammar, your teacher deducts your mark. But linguists say this is wrong. I mean, you know, language is what you just speak. It really doesn't matter, you know, only you decide what is wrong, right? As long as the communication is successful, it's perfectly fine. And the job of a linguist is to describe how people are using language or forming language. What is the grammar according to people's usage, not according to some book. So this is very important to remember. Now, how do you describe a language? It sounds very complicated, right? There are so many things. And yes, there are so many things, and linguists have come up with what a structural division of languages, I mean, sorry, not languages, the structure of a language can be described at various levels. So you can start by describing sounds, right? The vowels in a language, the consonants, etc. So this whole field is called phonetics and phonology. Then you could describe words. This field is lexicography, like noting down all the words that a language has. Lexicography is building dictionaries, basically. But also morphology, right? How words are formed in a language. So let's say unputdownable. Is that a valid English word or not? And why I could say that, or I may not be able to say that, right? So that's all rules of morphology, how words are formed with prefixes and suffixes. Then comes what we commonly call as grammar, or more formally syntax, which is how words are ordered in a sentence. You know, what is the relationship between the different words based on how they are kind of uh, kind of arranged in a sentence. Like one famous linguist, Steven Pinker, gives an example of this. Dog bites man, and a dog bites a man bites a dog. So all the words are same except for the flipping of two words in their position, man and bite, sorry, man and dog. And he says, you know, a dog bites a man, nobody cares except for that particular man. But a man bites a dog becomes top news, right? Because that's something very rare. So that's why order is very important, and that's what syntax is. Semantics is meaning. So the you know, how words acquire meanings, how those meanings change over time, how different words used in a sentence can mean different things. So for instance, there are words which mean multiple things. Like if I say bank, it could be a river bank, it could be banking on somebody, it could be, you know, a financial bank. So how do you distinguish between these different senses, different meanings, when a word is used in a context and things like that? Okay, then pragmatics is like how do you actually use language? It's okay to have meaning and grammar and everything, but then you might be sarcastic. So then what you say, I should not be taking it literally. So how do you know when to take it literally and when not to take it literally? And that's pragmatics. There might be various ways of dealing with literal and non-literal senses of things, and yeah, and I will get into more details of this. Pragmatics is very, very fascinating, so it demands more attention. All these are fascinating, by the way, but I think pragmatics is something which is more easy to understand because we do it all the time. Other things are more subtle and requires a little more training to analyze the grammar of a language and things like that. Last bit, and this is very important, is how you write a language. And why I say this is very important is often people conflate language with a written language. But when linguists say language, they always mean spoken language. And there are very many languages in the world which are never written. They don't have a script. They are never written. They were never written. And even in our language, right, you would have heard the Vedas have been transmitted through an oral tradition for a very long time. Why? Because nobody really wrote, Sanskrit in the Vedic period. So script came much later, writing came much later, and therefore you should not never, conflate between language and the writing system or the orthography. And many languages can use the same writing system. For instance, the Roman alphabet is used by French, English, German, Dutch, so many languages around the world, right? So the writing system is constant and very many languages are using it. So there are much fewer writing systems than the languages in the world. This is an important distinction to remember. Now, one interesting thing I want to mention here is, the first person who very, very systematically seemed to have described the grammar of a language comes from India. The name of the person is Panini. You might have heard this term. And he wrote a book called Ashtadhyayi describing the grammar of what we call classical Sanskrit. And it's pretty early, like 5th to 6th century BC. So you can imagine like how old it is. And interestingly, much, much later, maybe at the turn of last century, or maybe a little earlier, than when people started writing grammars for more formally for English and other Western languages, independently they arrived at the same kind of mathematical structures which Panini had used to write his sutras in Ashtadhyayi. So that's why a lot of credit is given to Panini in formalization of linguistics and this whole idea of that language can be studied as mathematical objects. But coming from Panini to current India, India is a fascinating place for studying languages and describing languages. So there are around 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world right now. And the languages are divided across families. India is the only country in the world probably which has languages from 5 different families spoken. So you would have all heard about Indo-Aryan languages, the North Indian languages like Hindi, Bangla, Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi, Kashmiri, and so on. And then the Dravidian languages, which form another family, Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam, and so on. But then we have also other families of languages like Tibeto-Burmese or Sino-Tibetan languages, which are spoken in the Northeast, like Manipuri, Kokborok, and languages in Sikkim, and so on. Then there are languages which are called Austronesian languages, like Khasi, spoken in Meghalaya, and Santhali, spoken in central India. And these are very Mundari, these are very different set of languages. And then we have languages like, spoken in the Andaman Islands, which are not classified into any of this because they are very, very different from any of these languages. You can't draw any connection to them. So it's a mystery, right? How do we classify these languages? And in fact, the person who studied these languages in great detail, her name is Professor Anvita Abbi. She received Padma Shri for all her studies. And it's like fascinating to read her memoirs or the books that she has written about her journey through how she studied all these languages. And as you know, some of these tribes like Jarva and all are extremely hostile. It's very difficult to, they are very territorial, so it's very difficult to study them. So, and she managed to go to those places and study and document their languages. And I'll just tell you one very interesting thing that we know, I mean, we learned about in the Andamanese languages. So they have this notion of what is called alienable and inalienable possessions. So imagine, you are speaking in English, or for that matter, any other Indian language, I mean, the popular Indian languages, let's say Hindi or Kannada. Uh, you would not distinguish between my hand and my house and my father and my eyes, right? It's the same my, just the noun changes. But in these languages, they have a very strong distinction between what is part of you versus what is not part of you. So my eyes, my hand, my head will be part of my body. So they become very, what we call inalienable. You cannot be separated from those things. So that's said in a certain way. Whereas my, let's say, house or my pen or my book is a different my, because those are not part of your body and they can be separated from there. And there are whole philosophies of, why this actually kind of maps to the notion of their lifestyle. Because in our world, right, we think we possess things. We possess land, we possess house, but in their culture they don't possess them. They just exist and they are using it. The only things they possess is their body parts. So that's kind of the philosophy from which this kind of a language might come from. These are hypotheses, of course, but that's pretty fascinating, I thought. So yeah, so when you start documenting and studying languages, right? So you find a large number of languages around the world, and there are certain areas in the world, the dark green ones in the map, which has very large density of different languages. India being one, you can see, Africa being one. The other important, I mean, Indonesia, and there's this island of Papua New Guinea, island nation of Papua New Guinea, which has extremely high diversity of languages. According to this graph, India has around 427 languages, but it totally depends on how you count, like whether Hindi and Bhojpuri are same language or not. These things become very difficult, whether Uttar Kannada and Kannada, Dakshin Kannada, the two dialects of, are two dialects of Kannada or are two different languages. So according to some estimates, India has 700 languages. According to some, it has 427. But India has one of the highest diversity of languages in the world. By the way, India also has the highest number of multilinguals in the world. And I will touch upon it a little later and get a little more into the details of this. Now, how does all these languages come into be? Do they always, did they always exist like this, or are languages also born, and do languages also die? So definitely languages, it's a dynamic thing. Languages change over time. New languages come and some languages die. In fact, here is a trivia that some of you might know. Which language derives its name from the Turkish word for army, because it developed in the military camps around early 19th century. I'm not going to ask you. I mean, that's one bad part of not having a face-to-face conversation. Otherwise, I would have asked. But in interest of time, I'll give you the answer. Design languages like Esperanto and all, which you would have heard of, and Urdu is of course natural, and there are Creoles and other things which keep coming. So languages are born. But the unfortunate thing is that languages die also. And in fact, languages are dying at an alarming rate. So today, every 2 weeks, one language, dies. What does it mean for a language to die? The last speaker, native speaker of that language, when that person dies, we call the language is dead. And what happened to that person's, children, progeny? So they would move to some other language which was spoken in that area. This happens a lot, right? In cities, a lot of people don't speak their mother tongue and move to a common language, lingua franca as we call it, might be English. So if you have watched this movie called, I think, English Medium, and there's another movie called Hindi Medium. So these actually quite nicely portray the social importance of prestige attached to a language and the economic value of learning a language. And that actually makes people to move to certain languages, which is also in some sense a sort of linguistic imperialism. And therefore languages are dying at a very fast rate. And unfortunately, with every language dying, we lose a worldview. We lose a lot of knowledge about, plants and animals and their way of life and so on and so forth. Uh, so for instance, there is this language called Oksapmin, and it has a very few native speakers. I don't have the number right now on my slide, but it's like in hundreds, and it's spoken in Papua New Guinea. They have this fascinating counting system which has base 27. So if I were to ask you what is the most common base for counting numbers across world's languages, you would probably just guess without any problem that it's 10. Now, in English, it's 10. It's in Hindi, in Marathi, in Kannada, in Telugu, all Indian languages, right? It's 10. In French might also have 20, but it's mostly 10 and so on, right? But there are languages, and this is nothing universal. Languages have base 3, base 4, base 5, base 16, base 8. So there are many, many languages. And if you look at statistics over all the world's languages, 10 is not the most common base, actually. And the reason why 10 is most popular is because the languages which use 10 have larger number of speakers rather than many languages using 10 as a base. So Oksapmin has 27 base, and you say, let's say you start with your left, sorry, it should be right. Right thumb is 1. So the name for right thumb, if I say right index, it is 2 and so on. And I come to, left pinky, and that becomes 27. Now, then if I have to count it for the next person, so I will say, 2 men and let's say 1 right thumb. What would it mean? 2 men is 27 plus 27, 54, and right thumb would be 1 more, so 55. So to express 55, they would say 2 men and right thumb. So this is how this language counts. Now imagine these languages dying, and we would lose so many different ways of looking at the world, right? How they classify space, how they classify time, how they classify the natural flora and fauna in their language, their social classification, all these things are so varied and so interesting. Now, the question that automatically arises is that since there is so much of variety, and in biological world also we talk of so much of variety, right? Aren't there anything common between languages? If every language is different, how do a linguist even go about studying languages? That would become extremely difficult task. So somehow I have to be able to categorize languages and find out what's common across languages. So biologists would do it by what are called phylum, orders, families. We call it taxonomy in biology, right? So similarly, in language, linguists would try to do the same thing. So there are 2 ways of classifying languages. One is you could look at, language families, which languages evolved from common ancestors. So that is what we call genetic classification. But genetic classification is probably not as important, or some other kind of classifications are more or as at least as much important as genetic classification, which is based on what linguists call typologies. So you try to look at languages and certain factors which are common or occur repeatedly across world's languages, and from there you try to form the various classes, fundamental classes in which language can belong across this dimension. Let me give you an example of how we construct typologies. So all languages have a distinction between nouns and verbs. All the languages make a distinction between nouns and verbs. So this is one language universal. It's true across languages universally. Now, why this is interesting is because not all languages make a distinction between noun and adjectives. There are many languages which doesn't have any adjective, right? So that's why this noun verb distinction is non-trivial. It's not just given that just because English does or Hindi does, all languages shouldn't be doing it. Turns out all languages that we know of do it. Now, once you have a notion of verb and noun, naturally in a sentence, there is a notion of subject, object, and verb. Most languages would make a distinction between subject and object. Here, I'm not saying all, by the way. There are languages which may not. But most languages we know make a distinction between a subject, object, and verb. Now, if you think of English, what is the order of subject, object, and verb? It's SVO, right? Subject, verb, object. I ate lunch. If it is Hindi, what's the order? Maine khana khaya. So khana is the object which comes in the second position. So SOV. So English has SVO, Hindi has SOV. So with three things, how many distinct orders can you have? It's a simple math question, 3 factorial, which will be 6. So there are 6 orders, SOV, SVO, VSO, and so on and so forth. And then in this graph, what's shown is, so first of all, you look at the statistics. If you look at all the, I mean, a very large number of languages, then, 500, I mean, 50% almost is SOV, which is like Hindi or Marathi. And another 488, so which is maybe 40%, is SVO, like English. But there are also languages which are VSO, verb comes first. There are languages which are VOS, and so on and so forth, right? So, so there is a dominant pattern, and this is what a typologist would map. So for a typology, the logist, the job would be to find out what are the dominant patterns and how they're distributed around the world. And SVO, SOV, and or so-called word order is one dimension. You could classify languages in all a very large number of dimensions, right? So for instance, I already showed you 2 examples. One is noun classes. How many noun classes does a language have? That could be one dimension for typology. What is the base in which they use they do counting? That could be another dimension for classification. So in this way, there are many dimensions which linguists work on and classify the languages. And what's interesting is genetically close languages need not be typologically close. This is very important to understand. So a lot of people, I don't know if you have heard this, but I hear this quite often, people claiming, oh, Japanese and Tamil. So people who are Tamil speakers, when they learn Japanese, or Japanese speaker learning Tamil, they find it fascinating that the grammar is almost identical. I don't know, by the way, neither I know Japanese nor Tamil, so I can't comment. But I have heard a lot of people saying this, oh, Tamil and Japanese are so similar, so maybe they are there is some genetic connection. Doesn't have to be. We know that languages which are totally genetically disconnected can have this kind of shared, typological features. And this is simply because of the statistics of the distribution. Certain features are just more common across world's languages. But is it enough, right? How to explain the existence of all these language universals and all this variation? That's, I mean, what I just said is just that genetic, connection probably doesn't explain. But then what do you evoke to explain that? In other words, right? One very easy to think hypothesis would be, I could say, all languages evolved from the same ancestor, and therefore whatever properties that ancestor had, now all languages have it. It's almost like biological evolution. All human beings probably evolved from the same single human being at some point, and those gene pools got carried over time, something like that. I mean, people have tried doing this kind of things. So one famous thing, of course, many of you would know, and this most linguists believe is true, is this, that there was a language called Proto-Indo-European, which was spoken somewhere in the, let's say, Central Asia around 10,000 BC or 8,000 BC, sorry, 8,000 BC. And then these people migrated through different, through different routes, on one extreme to China, on another extreme to, come down south to India, and on the west they went through Iran and all the way to the, end of Europe, including Greece, Italy, and on the other side to Spain and Portugal. Now, of course, not in one go, over time. And that's why all these languages, which I just talked about, like North Indian languages, there are some languages in northern China which are almost extinct now. Then there are languages in Russia and Russian itself and all other languages. Then Iranian and European languages, they all have lots of similarities. So this language is called the Proto-Indo-European language, from which they all came. Now, taking this argument further, you can go back and say, okay, all languages of the world came from a single language. Turns out it's extremely hard to justify this. We don't have enough evidence for that kind of a thing. So instead, on the other hand, there are some other cues which we might be using here. So here is an interesting cue, an observation rather. If you think of children, babies, they have amazing ability to kind of understand language just by immersion. Nobody teaches grammar to babies. Imagine, think about yourself when you were babies. Do you remember anybody teaching grammar, or if you have seen babies growing? Nobody teaches grammar. You just talk to the baby, and you just talk to other people around the baby, and the baby just observes and learns the language, right? And this ability is fascinating in two senses. One is it's not it's not cultural. So or in other words, what I mean to say is sorry, I shouldn't say it's not cultural. I should say it's not genetic. So whether you learn Hindi or Chinese, it's not a genetic thing. A kid born to Hindi speakers, if raised in China, would learn immaculate Chinese, and vice versa. So this has been observed time and again, right? And I think for most of you, it's not even surprising. The other interesting thing is that there is a critical window of learning language. So if you see the right-hand graph, right? So between from birth to an age of around 10 to 12, uh, babies or children are amazingly capable of learning language through this immersive process. But as you get older, that process somehow degrades. The brain doesn't have that capability anymore. And now, if I, at my age, want to learn a new language, I have to probably take a grammar book, read and memorize and learn it in that way. I can't just simply immerse myself and learn it as easily and quickly as kids do. So therefore, something biological is happening here, right? Definitely some biological thing is happening here. So taking that as a cue, and also the fact that languages around the world has so many similarities, Noam Chomsky, he is one of the most famous linguists who is alive today. And even for other reasons, Noam Chomsky is extremely famous. You would have heard his name. So he put forward this theory of what is called universal grammar. What Chomsky said is, in human brain, there are certain organs which are equipped to kind of learn and produce and comprehend and learn language. So this is what he calls faculty of language. So many of you might be already knowing, right? Human brains have a modular functionality. So different parts of brain helps you do different things. So there is a optical visual cortex which helps you process images. There's an auditory cortex which help you listen to sound and analyze sounds, right? And so on and so forth. So he is proposing a language unit in the brain which is specifically for processing language. And this all human beings are born with. And therefore, what that particular unit can learn and cannot learn, that defines the structure of language. And that is what he calls universal grammar, whatever the structure is. And all languages are different instantiation of the universal grammar. In the sense that, the universal grammar might tell you that languages should have distinction between subject, verb, and object, and they can be placed in any order. And when you pick up a language, you just learn what the order is in this language. So that's the way to think about this. So the kids are trying to find out those parameters to learn from the data, language data input, but the actual algorithm is already hard-coded in their brain. So they don't have to do much. But unfortunately, that learning, the parameter instantiation process becomes, is very plastic initially in early ages and become more and more rigid as time passes, and therefore people stop learning through immersion. And this theory was so popular. I'm saying was because now, and even when he proposed it, there were many alternative theories. So now there are more alternative theories, and people actually take those theories even more, quite seriously. So this is not, even this hypothesis is contested. But I think this was a very fascinating and very profound way of looking at language. It's almost like, if you are studying biology, it's almost like central dogma of biology, that genes give rise to proteins and proteins give rise to function. That fundamental a thing which kind of defines the entire biology. But talking of brains and biology, right? When it comes to biology, everything has to be explained in the context of evolution. Because in today's biology, unless you can explain it through evolution, people won't probably take you too seriously. So in this context also, Chomsky had to explain why, um, or Chomsky, I won't say Chomsky, linguists following this universal grammar theory have to explain at what point in the evolution of humans this particular organ in the brain developed, right? And then a natural question that comes is, do animals have that brain organ? Or if they don't have, then how do they communicate? Do animals have language? And we do know animals communicate, even plants communicate, right? Then what is the fundamental difference, if any, between their patterns of communication and humans' patterns, right? Because humans seem to doing it much more effectively than animals. Somehow it seems like. So is there any difference? So people did a lot and lot of studies, mostly with monkeys, but also with dolphins and other kinds of birds, insects, to see what kind of communication pattern they use and how it differs from human languages, if at all. And what people found out is basically there is one particular thing that all human languages do, which you know animal languages, at least we don't know of any animal languages doing it. And this is called the recursion. So, if I ask you what is the longest sentence possible in English or in any language for that matter, what would be your answer? Turns out that you can't construct a longest sentence. Imagine that the longest sentence is something S. You can always say that Pinker thinks that S is correct, right? So, and then you can say, you can extend it further. Panini once said that Pinker thinks that Chomsky is correct, and so on and so forth. So you can keep going on extending a sentence. There are many ways of extending a sentence. This is one particular way, but there are other ways. You could extend the sentence on the other dimension, other side also. So by adding more and more prepositional phrases and relative clauses and so on and so forth. So this is what we call recursion. And you are using the same structures again and again nested inside it. And this is something which gives a human language a tremendous capacity to express a whole lot of idea, generate very complicated things which you would not have heard ever before, and then make meaning of it. How do you make meaning of it? That meaning comes from composition. We know meanings of each word, from which make meanings of phrases. We know meanings of phrases, so we make meanings of sentences, and so on and so forth, right? So this is what seems like at the core of all human languages, which animal languages don't seem to have. Or communication techniques, animal communication mechanisms don't seem to have. So, so this is what most linguists think. Of course, there are again, everything I say, take it with pinch of salt. Later, don't go and say, okay, Monojit said this, but this book says otherwise. Because linguistics is a very evolving field. There are many hypotheses and many controversies in the field, and that's what makes it very, very interesting. There are very few things which are set in stone. Okay, so the last thing I just want to mention is when it comes to brain and how do we process language, obviously there are lots of questions that linguists have to answer, right? How does the brain comprehend and generate? How do children learn? What causes language deficiencies? You would have heard of dyslexia, aphasia, these kind of problems, right? What causes it? Then if it's a specific unit in the brain, then some gene must be responsible for causing it. What are those genes? And, how much of language is part of that gene? By the way, this gene is not about language parameters. This is about universal grammar I'm talking about. And how much of language is from your environment? So what is the interaction between them? And these are also questions. Unfortunately, I don't have time for going into any of these. In fact, it's already 6:30 and we have just finished the first island. But fortunately, the other 3 islands are much shorter. But let me stop here and ask the organizers. So how much time should I take, or can I take, number one? And if there are quick questions I can take, or maybe I will go through it and then take questions. But can you at least tell me how much time I can take to
Oh, well, actually, we're usually not very constrained on time. You can, how much ever time you require, it should be fine. As long as our participants are okay with it, I suppose. I suppose everyone's really interested, so I think we're fine on time.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is something very close to my heart. So I
Yeah,
will
yeah.
probably speak for another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No problem. I think we did have a couple of questions in the chat.
Maybe you can quickly
Yeah.
ask them.
Urvi, could you read off the chat because my it crashed from my side, so my chat has been erased. So if Urvi
Yeah, yeah,
can,
sure.
yeah.
Atharva was asking how languages started.
So I already tried answering that partly. Answering your question, I should say nobody knows. That's the answer. There are
Mm.
many hypotheses and we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because languages don't fossilize. So we don't even know when humans started speaking for the first time. Or even if, so we are Homo sapiens sapiens. Before us, there have been other, kind of groups of humans, right? Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, Homo heidelbergensis, other primates, human-like primates, right? In our genus. So we don't even know if they had a language, what kind of language, because languages had not been fossilized. There were no recorders. So the only thing we can study is the vocal cords. I mean, because some of those might have fossilized. So the shape of mouth and other things. But from them, it's very hard to generalize exactly when people started talking and how it all came about. So what we know is there are genes which actually are very strongly correlated with certain kind of linguistic developments like aphasia and all. So these genes are found in certain form in human and mutated form in chimpanzees and let's say gorillas, which means gorillas and chimpanzees, and that's kind of suggested as a reason why they don't have this complex a language like we do. So at some point there was this mutation in this gene. This is called FOXP2, but it's a gene cluster. There are other genes also. So which must have happened, which caused humans to speak, right? Or over time. By the way, note that it's not only a genetic process; it's also a cultural process. Uh, if you only speak and nobody else in the community, who would you speak to about what? So language was also simultaneously discovered by people and not discovered, invented by people, right? You would have invented conventions to refer to things and stuff like that. So it's a very fuzzy thing and very hard to put concrete numbers on anything. So some people say languages evolved 100,000 years ago. Some people say it evolved, let's say, merely 10,000 years ago. I think it certainly is older than 10,000, but probably closer to 100,000. Yeah.
Okay. Adrit has a couple of questions. One of them is related to this one. He's asking, did human language start off from animal communication?
Definitely, yes. If you look at other primates, they communicate so effectively. They have lots of alarm calls and all. So if you imagine the common ancestor of human and chimps, and let's say that particular ancestor didn't have a complex recursive language like we do today, because if that ancestor had, probably chimps or gorillas would have also had. So if we make that assumption, then certainly that common ancestor had some form of communication which would be closer to probably how chimps kind of communicate today. So it did evolve from that kind of thing, and there are very nice theories. So there are very funny theories and nice theories. So the funny theories are all around, there are theories called bow bow theory, which is like humans used to bark like dogs and eventually that turned into language and all. These are all speculations. And at some point, there was so much noise in this area and so much speculation that Linguistic Society of Paris had banned any work on language evolution. I think it was 1870 when they issued the ban. And this ban, or was it raised on 1870? I don't know. But in 19th century, people were saying all sorts of random things. And then later, as our science progressed, right, now we have better understanding of human history, biology and all. We can make more concrete statements. So yeah, your answer is yes, it certainly depends on that. And there are theories around that too. I can tell you more later, where you can read. Yeah.
The other things he was asking about, again from Adrit, he was wondering about linguistic groups, early linguistic groups, and he mentions Greek and Sanskrit languages being similar. And also he asks about Pidgin languages, how they were formed.
Yeah, so Greek and Sanskrit, I already told you, right? Proto-Indo-European, that's the common ancestor of Greek and Sanskrit. But by the way, Proto-Indo-European is not necessarily the oldest language in the world. No way the oldest language in the world. We have evidence of much older languages as well. Um, and and in India, the oldest language is considered, I mean, most linguists consider the Austronesian languages to be the oldest language in India, and they to be the earliest migrants, like Santali, Mundari, those languages. Some people even associate Gondi, which is a Dravidian language, to be the oldest. So this is a space which has a lot of debate, primarily because we don't know much. One thing, it's very hard. Like languages don't fossilize, the same reason. And the second reason is it's also very political, and therefore any statement you make, it's not clear, are you making it because of your political bias, or are you making it for a scientific evidence? And people try to confirm their biases with scientific evidence. And also this is a very I would say better not to go too detailed into that landscape right now, I mean, unless we understand the whole field very well. Yeah. um, the other question was pigeons. So pigeons are basically formed when you use grammar of one language and words of another. So this is typically like when two languages come into interact with each other, or there are multiple languages and people don't have a common language to talk to each other. They might borrow things from each other and try to communicate. So the grammar might have parts of one language and words from another language. So the word pigeon comes from business. It's the Chinese pronunciation of the word business, and that's because people needed these kind of languages for doing business. Some great examples of pigeons are in the Northeast India, like Nagamis and all, where basically people have to interact. Again, the same, Northeast India is extremely diverse in linguistics, in languages, right? So many, every hill, every tribe might have a different language. So they use, grammar of something like Hindi and lots of words from Hindi, English, as well as the local languages to form the pidgin. But pigeons don't have very well developed grammar, and it's a very, I mean, you can't it's very hard to, let's say, write literature in pigeons, because the grammatical structure and all are still evolving.
Shamit is asking a question. Maybe we can have this last question
Yeah,
for now and
yeah, we'll probably continue
continue.
the talk for now, and maybe the
I
next
think
break or
so.
at the end. Yeah, we'll
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, okay,
yeah.
let's do that.
That would be better. Yeah, because otherwise probably we'll spend an hour just answering questions.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah,
absolutely fine. At the end, we can
yeah,
even like
yeah,
ask
yeah,
them to
yeah.
unmute themselves, and yeah.
Correct. Okay, so now that we know about what a linguist do, more, I mean, at a very high level, we have seen that. So let's move to, what I do, or a computational linguist do. How do we make machines talk? So, all of you might have heard about this, that AI, this is the age of AI. And you might have even heard about hypes like, oh, machines are going to take over. Robots are here, they are coming. And people who know a little more in this field, you might have also heard about some very recent news 2 months ago. GPT-3, there was this thing released by OpenAI, which can write fake news, which is as good and indiscernible by human as it can be, right? So you can now generate articles or anything, and nobody would be able to discover that they're fake news. So there is a lot of hype that AI can solve a lot of problems, and there are a lot of also, fear because of the hype, probably. So let me try to tell you from the language perspective where exactly we are, and why, the hype, neither the hype nor the fear are grounded enough. So in 1950, Alan Turing, who can as well be termed as the father of AI, he's father of many things in computer science, actually. He suggested this test for artificial intelligence, which we now know as the Turing test. He said a computer would be artificially intelligent if a human, the lady here, while chatting, can't distinguish whether she is chatting to the man, another human, or the computer. So the test would be like this. This person will chat, let's say 6 times. 3 of the times it will be the another human being chatting, and 3 of the times it is the machine chatting. And for each of those 6 sessions, this person has to say, okay, this was human, this was machine, this was human, this was machine. And if this person is wrong enough times, or rather fooled by the machine to believe that it was human, then the machine passes what is called Turing test. And there was a huge prize announced for kind of clearing a machine which clears the Turing test. And looks like um, 4 or 5 years ago, one of the machine indeed passed Turing test, but that's of no concern to us here, because that's also part of a problem of how the test is exactly designed. But the part I want to you know uh, bring up here, the thing I want to bring up here is why Turing, of all things, chose language as the ultimate test of AI. Why Turing test is based on chatting in a human language instead of, let's say, playing chess. And if you think of it, right, all humans learn language almost effortlessly. Chess, on the other hand, is very, very hard. Learning chess is difficult. Playing and beating grandmasters is much more difficult. I think, at least I can't imagine even thinking about beating the local champion, forget about a grandmaster, even though I know rules of chess. Requires a lot of learning and practice and other things, right? Despite that, he didn't say chess. In fact, Turing very specifically says that games like chess, I know AI will be easily solving, but language is something which is much harder to solve. Turns out, it really turns out that language processing is one of the hardest things in AI. You already know that chess is solved, right? You already know that vision or speech is also quite solved. By vision, I mean object recognition. Computers can recognize objects very well. Yes, you can fool them, but more or less it recognizes objects very, very well. Even speech recognition, you can speak and it transcribes what you said, is also kind of solved, of course under certain assumptions. By the way, transcribing speech is not the same as language understanding. So here I should have said what makes natural language understanding very difficult. Even if you don't know the language, you might be able to transcribe, right? But you may not be able to make any sense of it. Transcribing is more like signal processing followed by some amount of language processing, but not really understanding language. So what makes language understanding such a hard problem? And experts think it will take another at least 40-50 years to solve NLP. I mean, solve language understanding, right? Even though we would have solved all other AI problems, NLP will be very hard. So the reason is as follows. Now, when I say, I saw a monkey with a banana, what image does come in front of you? Something like this, a cute little monkey sitting with a banana. May not be cute, but yeah, some monkey sitting with a banana. But is it the only interpretation of this sentence? What about this? I saw a monkey with a telescope would mean this, right? Now, instead of telescope, I could have been seeing a monkey with a banana. Maybe I put a tunnel inside the banana, put some lenses there, and I call it the banana telescope. So I saw a monkey with a banana. Or what about this? I was eating the banana. So banana was with me and I saw a monkey. Possible? And is that all? Can you think of any other interpretation? What about this? So there's a monkey which is sitting with a banana and I'm trying to saw it. Saw meaning cutting something using a saw. So the word saw is past tense of the verb see, but the word saw is also the present tense of the verb saw, to mean to cut something with a saw. So it could mean this. And if it means this, then it could also mean this, that I'm trying to saw the monkey with a banana saw. And of course, I am eating the banana and sawing the monkey is also possible. So you see, what's very, very interesting is such a simple sentence, which all of you might have not even thought for a second that could be ambiguous, right? You almost imagine the first image that I showed, but has so many different interpretations. And computers being computers, right, they do things very differently from how we humans reason. They would systematically parse the sentence, try to identify all meanings and everything. We'll end up with all these possibilities. Hopefully, if it is not wrong, it should end up with all these 6 7 possibilities. And now it's a huge difficult problem to determine what it meant. So the question to ask would be, how a human does it so easily, right? Turns out how a human does it is through what we call common sense. Common sense is very hard to define. So I will try to say certain aspects of common sense. So of course, linguistic knowledge is a part of your common sense. So you know the meaning of words, idioms, proverbs. This is your linguistic knowledge, basically. But also metaphors, proverbs, and those things also you know. Then you also have world knowledge. That's very important part of your common sense. For instance, you know that monkeys are usually seen with bananas, and banana is not an instrument for seeing. If I had said I saw a monkey with a telescope, your image in front of you would be very different. You would never imagine a monkey sitting with a telescope and I am seeing the monkey, right? So that's because you know telescope is an instrument of seeing. So that's your world's knowledge. Then you have contextual knowledge. So it could be that you know, I bought a banana from the nearby shop. I was walking and I saw a monkey with a banana. In this case, you are more confused whether I am talking about I having the banana or monkey having the banana, right? So if I give you enough context, based on the context in which the sentence is uttered, the meaning is changed. And how you use the context to interpret is also kind of some kind of common sense. I'm putting all these things under the umbrella term called common sense. But you can also consider each of them as separate and separately try to model this kind of knowledge. Last but not the least is socio-cultural norms, which I will you know, kind of get a little bit into more detail because that's very fascinating. Just give me 1 second, I'll be back. Yes. So what do you mean by socio-cultural norms, right? And how they affect our language perception. So often you will see when we communicate something, what we see and what our communicative intent is might be different. So I might say, you know, could you please pass that glass to me? Now, what is this? Linguistically, it's a sentence. I will put a question mark after this, right? Could you please give me that glass? What should be a typical answer to this? Yes, I could. No, I couldn't. These are valid answers. But if in a real scenario, if you had asked this to somebody and that person said, yes, I could and stopped, or yes, I couldn't stop, you would have you thought how rude, or this person doesn't know how to. I mean, you typically think the person is rude or you know, making fun of me or something like that, right? Because here the communicative intent is a request. Now, how a question becomes a request, and why did you pose the request as a question? Now, this is a social convention. That's because you wanted to be polite. And when we want to be polite, we don't want to order, pass the salt. We don't want to say this, please pass the salt. We don't want to say this. We want to make it even more polite. And we say, could you please pass the salt to me, right? But then politeness is also very context dependent. So social functions, right? So when how you express politeness is very, very complicated. So let's say you didn't do your homework and turned to your teacher and said, sorry, I didn't do my homework, ma'am, today. So your teacher said, could you please be kind enough to submit your homework by tomorrow? Was your teacher being polite to you? Maybe, but most of you probably will interpret your teacher being sarcastic to you. That's like an extreme. I mean, she really wanted to be, you know, extremely, what should I say, forceful, assertive when she said, you have to give it tomorrow. And one way of doing it is by saying, you know, she would not usually be say it in this tone, right? So by changing the tone, it's just reversal of polarity. So by being extra polite, she is being extra forceful. So it's language is very interesting, and all these how they evolve is very very culture specific. To give an example of culture, right, and I will have more examples from my work in a moment, but this is one of my favorite stories. um, I was in Grand Canyon in the United States. So after visiting Grand Canyon, and Grand Canyon is wonderful. I don't know how many of you have visited, but even if you have not visited, you might have seen photographs. It's really, really grand and something to see. So when I was coming back, the driver asked me that, how was the canyon? And I responded with a big smile and everything. Oh, it was very good. And she looked at me and said, very good. And she really looked sad. Wasn't it just awesome? She said. And then the realization dawned on me that, okay, I'm in the US and very good doesn't mean very good. Very good means okay. And to really say very good, you have to say awesome. So this graph actually kind of ridicules this idea. This is not a scientifically constructed graph. This is just meant to be funny. So it says in an objective distribution, you might say if it's in the average, you would say pretty good. Good will be like better than average, and awesome would be like the extreme end. And in the US, anything which is from pretty good to awesome is awesome. So when you are saying good, you are very good. You are just in the yellow zone and not really in the. Oh, sorry. When you are not saying awesome, you are actually in the yellow zone in the second graph, by the way. So which actually means is bad. Whereas Eastern European actually says, what is this garbage? Even if it is average, and I don't like it if it is like good, and even if it's very good, they will say even so. So of course this is stereotyping and this is meant to be funny, but it's true. It's true. There have been research that the meaning, the scope of adjectives in the same language, English, is very different from culture to culture and very different across languages, right? So this is what I mean by social norms and cultural norms. Um, Talking of social and cultural norms, right? Let me bring something interesting to the table. So here are 5 tweets that I collected from Twitter, real tweets. Can you look at them for a moment and tell me what's common to them? I don't know how you are going to tell me because you are all muted. But I will probably let you still look at it for a few seconds, and then I'll give you the answer.
Maybe
How many
you can.
languages are there
Sorry.
in the whole universe?
Universe, I
On this
really,
Earth, only on this planet Earth.
yeah. So there are 6,000 to 7,000 living languages. It depends on how do you count languages, but yeah, 6,000 is a good ballpark number.
Does each game has its own language?
Is that Atharva?
Excuse me, 1 minute.
So whoever is asking this question, I think it's Atharva. So I will take your questions at the end. Let me. That's a very interesting question. So I will answer it at the end. Please do ask me. Yeah. So did some of you might have got the answer. So the thing is, all these tweets have more than one language in them. The first one on the left top is what we call, it has Turkish and German. Then the second one has, I think, Spanish and English. The color codes are for 2 different languages, so you can see. The one at the bottom from Africa, Northern Africa, is Arabic and French, and so on. Now, people mix languages. This is absolutely commonplace in India. So I'm sure none of you are surprised that people in other areas of world also mix language, right? So this is what linguists call code mixing and code switching. Code mixing or code switching. And languages can be mixed in a conversation. Languages can be mixed in the same sentence, in the same words. Sometimes you mix languages, like if you want to say computero, So computer can be considered as English, let's say, and O is a Hindi suffix and so on. So it's a very, very common phenomenon. And what's interesting is it happens is known to happen in all multilingual societies. So multilingual societies are where people in the society speak multiple languages. So many people know multiple and the same set of languages. So in India, it's common between all Indian languages and English, especially in urban sets in cities, because people do know English. And especially when we are doing technical conversations and all, we often mix English with, we have to use English uh, the way we are trained, right? We all learn our technical things in English, so we can't use the native terms. We don't know the native terms. So sometimes we would talk in English and mix other languages. So there are many interesting questions here. So I gave you one example of why I might use English in one context and let's say Hindi in another context. Is that all? Like what drives the language choice or the preference that you are making in a setup? So let's say I know 3 languages, Bengali, Hindi, and English. When do I talk in English? When in Bengali? When in Hindi? When do I choose to mix between these languages and so on and so forth? So this is a very interesting sociolinguistic question. Sociolinguistics study the interaction between society and language, right? All the things that I have been talking about, norms and things come under sociolinguistics. Then code switching, of course, is interesting in itself. And what is interesting about code switching is, any given mix of Hindi and English words doesn't make a valid English Hindi code switching sentence. I'm taking English and Hindi as an example because I know these languages. So let's say I have a sentence, teacher issued a book for the student from the library. And I want to code switch it. I can say teacher ne library se student ke liye book issue ki. It becomes a Hindi English code mixed sentence. But can I say teacher ne from library issued ki book for student, something like that? That sounds more unnatural, right? And you could think of even more unnatural things like may go to school every day. Does it sound natural to you? Most people would find it unnatural. So there are lots of interesting questions about what is the grammar of code switching and all that. That goes into the domain of syntax. I'm not getting into that, but let's talk about the culture and the society here. So why do people switch between languages? So if I were to guess, right, and if you think of what linguists have said before, so one is formal versus informal setup. In formal setup, you use some language, in informal, something else. Humor, sarcasm, all these things are factors when you choose language and so on. But one interesting factor that linguists say is when you talk about some facts, be it technical, non-technical, whatever, facts, you tend to, often you might choose the non-native language, let's say English. But if you are expressing an opinion or some emotional content, you typically switch to your native language. So let's say Hindi or Marathi, whatever your native language is. So we thought, okay, let's do a study of this on Twitter. We collected lots of tweets and then, identified the sentiment, identified the language used. And by the way, all these requires natural language processing. So you have to build the tool to automatically identify the sentiment from the words of a sentence, right? And so on and so forth. So all this we did. And unfortunately, we did not find any correlation between language and opinion versus fact. So we were, and it's very common in research, right? When you do research, you formulate hypothesis, you go and test your hypothesis. It's not necessary that that will be the right hypothesis, or the data will show that. So we're sad, but we are thinking, okay, what's happening? Something looks like, something is going here. We looked at the data and tried to think more. And then we thought, okay, maybe it's not fact versus opinion. It's maybe the polarity of opinion, right? Whether it's a negative opinion or a positive opinion. We did a further analysis. We divided the opinion into positive sentiment, negative sentiment, and neutral sentiment. And then we found out something really, really fascinating. So in Twitter, Indian users, bilingual users, what they do is they have a preference to use native language, in this case, which was Hindi, as much as 10 times more for negativity and swearing, whereas English is far more common for positive sentiment. So we wrote a paper We called it, we might praise you in English, but gali to Hindi mein hi denge. It's kind of one of my favorite titles amongst all my papers. Um, and, and if you see the left, graphs, you can see the fraction of tweets with swear words in English, which is the dark blue, versus Hindi, which is the light blue. So people tend to swear a lot more in Hindi than in English. And it goes back to that emotion finding that linguists had said, right? So opinions may not have any emotion attached to it always, but swearing typically always have an emotion attached to it, a very strong negative emotion. So whenever there is a very strong negative emotion, you want to swear in the native language because that gives you the punch. Swearing in English doesn't give you that much of a punch. And in fact, we saw it further when we do a gender wise. So we did city wise, gender wise, all kinds of analysis. So in gender wise analysis, it was very interesting. So this trend was even more stronger for men. For women, they swear much, much less than men, which was already known to linguists, and probably most of you know by your observing people around you. But even when they did, they tried to switch to English, just the reverse pattern. Why? Same reason. Swearing in native language sounds like really, really harsh and rude, whereas English sounds a little less harsh and rude, more sophisticated maybe. So there was a very interesting gender difference here. So while I was talking about how to make machines talk, and understand language, but it also gives us an interesting set of facts that linguists need to find out, like how language and context depends, language and identity, how they interact, and so on and so forth. One thing I want to mention before I go to the next part, because I already introduced what I work on. The last bit was on my work, and I will continue a little more on my work, and then we will end in probably another 5 minutes. But uh, one thing I want to add is, while I said that language processing is not solved and there are all these hard issues, but I should also add that because of machine learning approaches, especially deep learning, we can achieve far better accuracies in many language solved processing tasks today than we could do, let's say, even 5 years ago. These tasks are like predicting the next word that you might be typing, which might make your auto predict much better, or predicting sentiment from sentences. So even though it does not understand exactly what is being said, but still looking at the distribution of words and the surrounding words and other things, it still can able to guess the sentiment with very high accuracy. And one thing to notice here is we require a lot of data to train these systems. So these are machine learning systems. So what they do is, if you give them a lot of language data, often annotated. So we call, let's say you want to translate between English and Hindi. What would you do? You would give a lot of sentences in English and its translation in Hindi. So these are called parallel sentences. You will give, let's say, 1 million of those sentences to the machine, and machine will automatically try to learn a pattern of how to transform an English sentence to Hindi sentence, or vice versa. So that's how it works. So you do need a lot of data, the language data, to train. What kind of data exactly, and all those details I can't get into. The interesting bit is that landscape is changing very fast, and getting into that would be yet another talk in its own. So rather, I will very quickly tell you what I have been up to, right? My journey through this entire space of linguistics to computer, or rather computer science to linguistics to computational linguistics. So my introduction, so the way to read the slide is from left to right, and the size would mean how much time I spent on those problems. So my introduction to linguistics happened quite coincidentally when I was doing my undergrad in that was 2001. Yeah, so 20 years ago. And we were trying to solve this very seemingly simple problem, how to model pronunciations of Hindi words. Turns out that, I mean, most people would think English pronunciations are notoriously hard, right? You have to learn it. It's put, put is put, but beauty is but, and you have to learn it. How do you derive that? But in Hindi, pronunciations are almost kya, I mean, exactly what you write, you pronounce it. And not only Hindi, like most Indian languages would do that. So what's the problem there? The problem is the us. The ers actually you write, or I mean, you don't write, they are implicitly always there, but sometimes you pronounce them and sometimes you don't. Like if I look at the word bachpan, what do you write? Bachapana. All the letters, ba has a after it, cha has a after it. That's the vowel. But that vowel is called the inherent vowel, or linguistically it's called the schwa. So you don't write it, but you pronounce it. But problem is you don't pronounce it always. You don't say bacha pana. You will say bach pan. So you deleted the after cha and na, but pronounced it after ba and pa. So when do you pronounce it and when do you delete it? That was a problem that was affecting a text-to-speech system. So we were building in our lab a system which where you would give it a text and it would read it out, and it was made for blind people. So that it's called a screen reader, which could help them, work in a computer like anybody else do. So it will read it out. But it was a problem. It wasn't reading out properly because we didn't know which us to retain and which us to delete. So obviously, being computer scientists, most people around me, like my project partner and all, wanted to use machine learning. But I was thinking, look, wait. I think there is some pattern going on here. And I noted down, many words and their pronunciation patterns and all, and came up with a very neat rule. I can't get into the detail of that neat rule because it will take some more, information and analysis. But it's a very simple rule. If this happens, then retain the schwa, otherwise delete the schwa. Some 4-5 rules you follow and you get 100% accuracy nearly. That got me fascinated, and we wrote a paper and all. But then eventually one of my friend found out a book, an entire book, which is called schwa deletion in Hindi. And he said, hey Monojit, look, you were trying to solve this problem, and this there is an entire book on this. And that book is by a very famous phonologist called Manjari Ohala. John Ohala is a very well-known phonetician and phonologist, and Manjari Ohala, both of them, they are husband and wife. So Manjari Ohala has an entire book on this, and I started reading the book. So that was my first introduction to linguistics while reading the book, and I had to pick up so many terms, right? Phones, phonemes, this, that, very, very technical terms. But in the process, what gave me a kick was her rule at the end that she arrives is exactly what I arrived at. So linguistics can be done intuitively. If you have a logical mind and if you have a love for language, you can do it. So that gave me the kick, and I thought, okay, I have to take it to and look at it more deeply. So then I thought, okay, I will continue doing my PhD on this problem. So I generalized this problem a little more, and instead of asking this question of what is the rule for Hindi schwa deletion, I looked at across Indian languages what happens. Sanskrit has no schwa deletion. Odia has very little schwa deletion. Bangla has little more than Odia, but less than Hindi. Punjabi has even more than Hindi. So different Indian languages seem to behave slightly differently. There are similarities and differences. And why that happened over time, how that evolved, assuming that all these languages evolved from Sanskrit. So my PhD eventually ended up being modeling, computationally modeling the evolution and change in languages over time. And I would say it was as linguistic as it could get. So I could read lots and lots of books on language evolution. So that's why when you ask all these questions, it's very close to my heart. Those were all the questions and books and controversies that I read during my PhD. Okay, so then I moved to Microsoft Research as a researcher, and I continued working on some of those problems that I mentioned. But the bigger problem that I have been focusing on for last 6-7 years is code mixing. I introduced code mixing in the last few slides to you, right? And the issue in code mixing is most of the NLP systems are trained on only one language. So if you want to, kind of work at multiple language, I mean, if people code mix, right, these systems fail because they are not used to handling multiple languages. So how do you make a translator work on code mixed input, a sentiment analyzer work on code mixed input, a speech recognizer work on code mixed input? So those are the kind of problems we are working on. In parallel also, like why people code mix. And in almost in parallel in Microsoft, I have also been looking at, what I call enabling the speakers of low resource languages. Remember I told you that you need a lot of data to train these systems. Now, how much data do we have? Unfortunately, very little for Indian languages. So Hindi is the only Indian language which has some resources, Most of the other languages, even though spoken by lots and lots of people, have very little resources. And if you go further, down meaning if you go beyond the top 10 most spoken Indian languages and go to languages like Konkani or Tulu or Santhali, absolutely no resources. So how do you help bring the benefits of technology, language technology, to these people? And also, unless there is technology, remember I told you how languages are dying. Now, one of the big issue why languages might be dying today more quickly is because of technology. So if I have all my apps in English and no other Indian language, and apps are so convenient, so I have to learn English and start apps, right? And in the process I might start using my language even less and less, right? And this is happening not with probably major languages, but this is certainly happening with minority languages, endangered languages, and so on. And something which very recently I have picked up, it's called natural language inferencing. It's kind of the most hard problem in NLP, which is like I give you a set of sentences, one or many sentences, and a hypothesis, and you have to say whether the hypothesis was true according to these sentences or not. So I might say I was walking down the road and bought a banana from the shop, and I then stumbled upon a monkey with a banana. And now the hypothesis is the monkey had the banana. Is it true or false? Now, the machine has to infer that. It's one of the very fundamental problems, and there are lots of challenges. And it's kind of, it's totally, I would say, unsolved yet. I mean, even though we have lots of techniques, but nothing can really solve that. I won't get into any more detail of any of these. If there are questions later, I'll be happy to answer. I will just leave you with a couple of slides on where to begin before we end. So one fantastic place to start exploring linguistics is, I think, this International Linguistics Olympiad, which many of you may not have heard about. So you would have heard about Mathematics Olympiad, Physics Olympiad, and so on. And there are many Olympiads, 13, I think, to be precise. And linguistics is one of the newer ones. It started in 2003. What's interesting is, unlike other science Olympiads, here you can go with a clean slate. You really don't need to learn or mug up any theory or anything. The questions are all puzzles, like the Japanese puzzle I showed you in the beginning. They are all exactly like this. Of course, if you practice those puzzles more, you will get better. If you know a little bit of linguistics, you will get better. But definitely that's not a requirement. I'll quickly give you some facts. So in India, it happens in 2 rounds. First, we call it the Panini Linguistics Olympiad. Remember Panini of Ashtadhyayi, who wrote the Sanskrit grammar, right? So named after him. So Panini Linguistics Olympiad round 1 is from class 6 to 12 students can participate. It happens across 12 cities. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I don't know what will happen next year. So it usually happens in January and registration starts in November. I hope till then COVID is settled. Let's see. Then the second round, which unfortunately we had to cancel this year for COVID, happens with a bunch of students that we select from round 1. It happens in IIIT Hyderabad. It's a 10-day camp. It's a lot of fun, actually. Everybody who has come, I mean, if you go to the website of PLO, there's a video. Just watch that video that was made in one of the camps. So students come and stay for 10 days and learn from about linguistics, computational linguistics, and solve many puzzles. But more than all this, it's kind of a lot of fun. Then we also started something called the Asia Pacific Linguistics Olympiad from last year. Usually it happens in May, but again, because of COVID, this time it's happening in September. I'm not yet sure if India will participate because again of COVID. Yeah. And then finally, International Linguistics Olympiad happens sometimes in August. Each year it happens in a different country. This year it got cancelled. It was supposed to be in Latvia. Last year it was in South Korea. Yeah. Next year, probably, I have to check where it will be next year. I mean, they might repeat Latvia because Latvia got cancelled. So it might be in Latvia next year. And there are 4 students in a team per country. Up to 2 teams are possible. So here are some sample questions. This is very similar to the Japanese question. So this is some language called Kunuz Nubian, spoken by around 50,000 people in Sudan. It's a Eastern Sudanic language, so in Africa. And here are sentences and their translations. And then you are given 5 more sentences in Kunuz Nubian, and you have to translate to English. And similarly, 5 more in English and to Kunuz Nubian. There are many interesting things happening here. We won't have time to get into those. This is an easier problem. If I give you 2 minutes, probably many of you can solve it here itself. So here are a bunch of numbers in a language called EI. This spoke by 4,000 people somewhere in an island near Australia. And what happens in this language, what happens in this puzzle is every word, every number is 2 plus the previous number. So it's a arithmetic sequence, arithmetic progression with a common difference of 2. And you have to identify the numbers. Seems like quite impossible, right? Just from 7 numbers which are in arithmetic progression. How do you figure it out what they are? But it's a very interesting problem. Actually, it's possible to do it. Okay. So let me wrap up by just at a high level summarizing what I want you to take away from this journey. So one is that the world of languages is full of diversity and surprises, right? And there are several universally found structures, and it's quite interesting to study all these things. Linguists study languages from various perspectives, like its structure, function, sociocultural usage, and all. And linguistics is an extremely interdisciplinary field, right? There is cognitive science, psychology, but there is also mathematics, computer science, and logic, philosophy. There is sociology, anthropology, there is biology, genetics, even physics. So, from any field you can make an entry into linguistics and vice versa. Then, one thing which I say with some pathos is languages are disappearing at an alarming rate, something we all should be worried about. Because with a language, a way of looking at the world disappears. So it's extremely important from that point to at least provide the ingredients or the support to revive or revitalize a language when the speakers want to do so. Of course, if the speakers don't want to speak a language, we are not going to force them. But we should not force them to lose their language also, right? So that is important. And last bit is language understanding, or NLP, is one of the hardest problems of AI, which the whole world is looking up to these days. And most of the news that AI is making, a lot of them are from NLP. So it's quite challenging as well as exciting for people like me who work in this field at this point of time. So with that, thanks again. Thanks to all of you for staying back for so long and asking questions. I'll take more questions. And thanks to Launchpad for giving this wonderful opportunity to talk to you. I hope you guys are now more enthusiastic and interested in linguistics, and you want to go and find more. So about my work, you can always go to my website and find more. But if you want to go, find more about linguistics in general, you can go to any of these linguistics Olympiad website. I didn't suggest any book and all because there are so many. I didn't know which one to suggest and which one not to write. But if you personally write to me and tell your interest, I can suggest 1 or 2 books for you specifically.